let's get rolling. So welcome today to this BNL or By Name List and Coordinated Access webinar on this November 17th of 2021. I cannot believe it. I'm sure people are being inundated with Christmas decorations in the stores and maybe even doing some of your own decorating already. But it seems like the minute that Halloween is over, all the Christmas stuff comes out, but time is flying very quickly. So we're really grateful to have you here to talk about this topic today. I do want to begin by doing sort of a cross or pan-Canadian land acknowledgement that we like to do. And so I'll just read this out while you can read along if you like. And while I do that, you know, I know many of you have posted in the chat sort of where you're from and the land that you're working on and taking part of. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We recognize the historic and ongoing impacts of colonization and are committed to decolonization of our systems and ongoing reconciliation, guided in our work by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The TRC calls to action missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, calls to justice, and the principles of empowerment and self-determination. The Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness is committed to equity, dignity, justice, and belonging, and we are dedicated to serving equity-seeking communities as anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and inclusive allies. And we are working very hard to take that very seriously, and it's important to us. So thank you for indulging me in that little bit of reading. So our mission at the Canadian Alliance is to lead a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities working together to end homelessness in Canada. And this is what you can find on our website. It sort of outlines the different areas of focus that we have. Quinn and I are both coming to you as part of the Training and Technical Assistance Program. And I know many of you are familiar with many of the other aspects of our organization, but feel free to go to our website at cah.ca and look for further information on any of these items and much more. We want to make sure that we acknowledge that this webinar is in part funded by the Canadian government based on the Reaching Home strategy that Canada has for ending homelessness. We're grateful for them as a partner and for making things like this possible. As we said, I am Wally Check, your facilitator really for this. You know Quinn Morkey, who's a much more handsome fellow than I am. And so you're unlucky that you have to see my face more than you do his today. But as we get started here on this topic, I want to share with you a little video. And actually, I'm going to stop sharing my slides here for a minute so that I can make sure that I optimize things so that the video shows clearly. But as I read that land acknowledgement, it made mention of an organization that is important in decolonization of not only Canada, but other nations. And so I want to share this 2-minute video with you, and then we'll talk a little bit afterwards about why it matters in this topic.
Wally, you're in notes mode, just to want to change that.
The Second World War caused enormous...
Am I? Okay. Sorry. How's that?
Perfect.
Better? Okay. All right, we'll start that over. My apologies, people.
The Second World War caused enormous destruction and left large parts of the world in ruins. That's why the United Nations was established with one main target: to prevent war in the future. The UN is a meeting point where leaders from all around the world can interact. In the UN, countries try to agree on which rules and agreements should apply in the world. The most important topics of discussion in the UN are peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. The Sustainable Development Goals is the United Nations global agenda to end poverty, fight inequality, and combat climate change by 2030. There are 17 goals and 169 targets. The agenda serves as a joint roadmap for all the countries in the world. One of the main principles of the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind. The most vulnerable should be given priority. In the UN General Assembly, all countries, small and large, have one vote and the same say. All member states are committed to follow the Constitution of the United Nations, the UN Charter, where peace and human rights are central topics. The most powerful organ of the UN is the Security Council. It's in charge of maintaining peace and security between nations. The Council has 15 members, 5 of which are permanent, and the remaining 10 members are elected for 2-year terms. Even though the UN is the most important organization working for world peace today, it also receives criticism for its shortcomings in the face of modern-day conflicts. Many argue that the organization needs to change to remain important in the future. The UN General Secretary has called for major reforms of the organization. Several member states have supported change to maintain world peace in years to come. No matter how you look at it, the UN is one of the most important meeting points in the world, as well as an arena for international cooperation. Even though the UN isn't perfect, it is the best we've got, and all nations must work together to take care of our world.
So I'm just going to stop sharing quickly, and I want to actually open things up a little bit, especially since we have not such a huge audience. But I wanted to just ask the question, and feel free to post your comments in the chat or whatever, or feel free to let us know, and we can unmute you and we can have you share your response. But I want you to think about what does that video have to do with what you came here to talk about, if anything? How does that apply? What does this information about the United Nations say to us about governance models within coordinated access systems? I'd be really curious to know your thoughts, and and so start posting some comments in the chat to begin with. But I want you to think about some of the things that they said in that video, some of the things that they talked about in terms of their goals, their roles, their structure, those kinds of things. Any thoughts that people have? Jump in, don't be afraid, don't be shy. And Quinn, what did you think of?
Well, I mean, certainly in the governance webinar, we're talking about an organization who has a very unique kind of governance, if you can call it that, diplomacy. We are getting some comments in the chat too, reflecting on how nations come together to achieve a common goal and the importance of prioritizing limited resources to those in need, shows all the contributing agencies, or in this case, countries, have a voice to use and advocate while working towards one focus. And obviously, they're difficult to navigate, and they're all we have.
Yeah, very true. Very true. But yeah, some of those thoughts are, I think important. It's like there's a couple more coming in.
Mm-hmm. It's not perfect, but it's what we have, working continually to improve, to better work together towards collective goals, representative of the community voices, human rights, supporting those who are most vulnerable. Mm-hmm.
So while you think further about this, I want to ask another question. Does anybody know how many countries the United Nations started with? And how many are currently in their membership now? So give that some thought. Feel free to Google it if you like. But keeping some of those thoughts in mind, I think those are good comments. And so I want to move beyond that to talk a little bit more about it, because one of the things that governs what's happening with the United Nations is this charter, the United Nations Charter. And so as you see the points listed here, you know, it's the foundational treaty of the United Nations, intergovernmental organization. It outlines the United Nations as an intergovernmental organization. It outlines the purposes and the governing structure and overall framework, the mandates of the UN and its members. It upholds international law, achieves higher standards of living, addresses economic, social, health, and related problems, promotes universal respect for human rights and freedoms, and it's binding on all members. And when we talk about the governing structure, I mean, essentially it's broken down this way. Quinn mentioned diplomacy, but these are really sort of the governing bodies within the governance structure of the United Nations. And so they have several committees that meet together on different topics, and they all have a different mandate and different roles and responsibilities within that process. But when we talk about the membership, there's actually today 193 nations represented in the membership of the UN. It began with 51 at the end of the war, but there's 193. And so the biggest point I'm trying to make with all of this is that each of these nations, independent of themselves, have their own government and are beholden to themselves, and they make their own laws, and they structure how they govern the people in their own way. But each of those countries have also made a decision. 193 of them have made a decision to come together under the umbrella of the United Nations to also be accountable to this charter that we just talked about, and to be mandated by some guidelines and regulations and direction and vision and missions to be united in one way, or in multiple ways, I should say. But they are united in that vision of what the United Nations stands for. And so if 193 entire countries can say, we can let go of some of our need to control everything about what we do and be willing to come together as a group of countries and say, regardless of our own laws and regulations, we will also agree to abide by a common set of regulations in this charter so that we can better coordinate our efforts and work together to achieve this common goal. If that can happen, then I believe that it's possible and it's worthwhile for however many organizations within your community that are touch points for the homeless people experiencing homelessness can also come together in a similar fashion and be willing to say, we don't have to let go of our own organizational guidelines and policies necessarily. We might have to make some adjustments and some tweaks, but we should be able to come together within our community to be able to form some common goals and some common direction, common mandate in order to better coordinate to end homelessness. And so I just would encourage you to think about that a little bit, that if all of these countries can do this, and I mean, it's not without its struggles, but it happens, then can you also do this? So Reaching Home in its Coordinated Access Guide talks about the requirement for designated communities, for their funded communities, to build an appropriate governance operating model. And that model requires coordination from various community members. It requires input from community members to form a structure that is going to be effective and appropriate. And so even though you're creating a system where people are working together under a common umbrella, everyone's input has to be included in order to make that possible. And so there's some key factors that need to be included in this governing structure. And we're going to talk about some of those. First, I want to share with you a quote that was part of a blog that the Canadian Alliance put out quite some time ago, where it says there has to be a system leader. So just like even in the United Nations, there has to be a leader that sort of oversees the common mandate of what all of those countries have come together for. There also has to be a leader in your coordinated access system. This management body is ideally a dedicated team positioned and approved by system participants to provide oversight, guidance, monitoring, and evaluation, and the development of the coordinated access system policies and procedures. They would ensure best practices within the system, and most of all, they work to keep the coordinated access system consistent and in fidelity to the housing first approach and the established community process. All of this would be done by incorporating feedback from community, including persons with lived experience. And so there's a couple of things I want to mention in there. Feedback from community, persons with lived experience, best practices, and dedicated team. Those are really important things to think about. And what does a dedicated team mean? We're talking about staffing that is dedicated to those roles and is not just including this responsibility as one corner of their desk. So when we talk about lived experience and feedback from the community, this is what I think about, the importance of community involvement. So on the left here, we have an image of a group of people, which looks to me like a fairly
Wally,
people.
You're not sharing.
I'm not?
No.
Wow. Okay, well, it looks to me like I am. Okay. All right. Well. Okay. This better?
Perfect.
Sorry, people. So I'll share this slide with you, and let me just make sure. Yeah, that'll work. Start there. So this is what I was telling you. This quote on the left comes right from the Reaching Home Coordinated Access Guide. And then this is what I just shared with you. So you see here these two images of what could be a coordinated access table. And what I want to tell you is the one on the right needs to essentially go away, because what we have there is we have a non-diverse group of people talking about some individuals that they really probably don't know very much about. So the importance of this is to make sure that we have people included and that we're getting feedback in the community from people that will actually be able to help us understand the situation. I listened to a gentleman by the name of Peter Block years ago make a speech about community development. And in that speech, he said that we would have less meetings, and the meetings we do have would take less time if we included the people we're talking about in those meetings. And so this is where diverse community feedback, including those with lived experience, comes in as being an important part of who you need to have as part of your table. And I also want to highlight, you know, the other stakeholders, a diverse group of service providers, and for many communities, if not all, Indigenous leadership, not just Indigenous representation, but Indigenous leadership within these groups and within the leadership of your coordinated access. Before we get further into talking about some specific models of governance, I want to just share a little bit with you about what the roles and responsibilities are for governance models within coordinated access. So as you see here, there's some fairly significant things. This is not light work that your organizations have to do. You have to develop and implement the coordinated access system and your HMIS or your HIFS, your data collection capabilities. You have to be able to support change management within your community and champion that and help people understand the importance of building this type of coordinated system and build the political will that goes along with that. Then once your system is in place, your role would be involving ongoing management and accountability. How do we make sure that our system is operating the way it was intended to? How do we make sure that people are fulfilling the roles that they signed up to fulfill, and collect the data that we need to collect to help us make continuous, ongoing, effective change? And then that also involves the day-to-day operations of it. And then when we do decide and learn what kinds of things need to be improved, how do we make those improvements occur? How do we implement them and build them into our system?
Wally, I have a question here from Gina that asks, can the system leader be a committee? What are the pros and cons of a committee as a leader?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question. And I'm going to provide somewhat of an answer now and then defer to a little bit later in the presentation that hopefully might tease that out a little bit more. But I would say that if your community feels like a committee is better suited to be the leader, then so be it. However, at the same time, I think there's value in ensuring that there is at least a couple of people, one at least, depending on the size of your community, that have what we often refer to here at the Canadian Alliance as the big red ball on ensuring that a lot of elements are being completed. So that can be done, though, as a committee by making assignments, following up on those assignments and so forth. But generally, there needs to be somebody who's going to sort of be the coordinator of that process, who's going to kind of be the gel or the glue, as I'll refer to later, that holds all of that together. But there's a lot of flexibility in how you structure that leadership role of your coordinated access system. There is no one set way. And so I think that if you are creative and you find that you can make that happen by using a sort of a committee format, then great. And I think that your learnings would be very helpful for a lot of other communities. So it'd be important to share that out. But we will get into that a little bit further as we move on. Structurally, community entities are generally in partnership with their CAB or community advisory boards, and are leading the process of establishing the coordinated access governance structure. And so there's key roles in supporting an integrated approach to coordinated access. And so this is where we'll start to maybe talk a little bit more about what Gina was asking. So within the system structure, there should be some level of a coordinated access leadership group. Their primary jobs, overseeing the planning and implementation and monitoring of the system, as well as approving the policies and protocols and procedures that are put in place or put forward to govern that coordinated access system. Then there should be a coordinated access and HIMSS or HMIS working group. Now, they might be the same, but they could also be different. Their main roles are to advise the coordinated access leadership group and to develop the policies and protocols that the coordinated access leadership group are going to approve. Then we have the coordinated access lead. So as it says here, the coordinated access requires a lead that has sufficient capacity to provide administrative support for initial setup, implementation, and ongoing maintenance of the system. And the coordinated access lead requires dedicated staffing with workers who are impartial and objective. And they're the operational glue of the coordinated access process, meeting administrative needs. So it definitely can be more than one person, and it definitely can be sort of assigned roles from a committee. But the importance is that there is a consistent person that is always in the know of the things that are going on in the system, so that they can report and monitor and keep track of things and make sure that the rest of the group is aware of all of the details, sort of the one that pulls it all together in the end. Then we also have the HMIS and HIMSS lead. Now there's a lot of things listed here, and I don't want them to scare anybody away from being sort of that lead role in the data collection aspect of things, but they do have a key responsibility in the work that's happening with coordinated access. And again, that in some communities, the HIMSS lead and the coordinated access lead are the same. In other communities, the capacity is different, such that they are able to financially separate those roles out. For example, I know some communities, the community that Quinn came from, for example, in Edmonton with Homeward Trust, that organization has an entire data team that would be this HMIS lead for their coordinated access system. Whereas other communities don't have that same capacity. So therefore it might be one other person, or the community, the coordinated access lead and the HIMSS lead are the same individual. It just depends on what your community can do and what works. So let's just talk quickly about some of the key models. And there's really three key sort of high-level models of governance, and then I'm going to open it up for us to talk about what it's like for you and your community, what questions you have about these governance models, because they can be tweaked and adjusted and flexible in how you do them. So the first one I want to share, and some of this information comes from the System Planning Collective, that is a group of folks made up of the the homeless hub people, or the conservatory on homelessness, and the Away Home Canada and Turner Strategies. They've developed some great resources around this. And so I've stolen some of that information from them. But community entity is a standalone organization. So typically what this might look like is you have your CAB, or your community advisory board, and then you have the group that governs that, and you have the financial aspect of things that has to be accounted for. And so you have this governing body that oversees the community entity, like the board of directors and your CAB, and then you have an executive director for that community entity staff and the community entity staff that's involved. So this is a situation where the community entity by itself covers off all of those roles. So as I mentioned, Homeward Trust in Edmonton, the Calgary Homeless Foundation, the community entity in several other communities are made up this way, where all of the governance structure is within that organization all by itself. And so the board of directors is the governing body of a nonprofit or charitable organization, and directors are responsible for overseeing the organization's activities and the strategic direction of the organization. And there's accountability placed on the director from a legal perspective. And if a collective impact initiative to address homelessness is run out of an organization like this, then technically that organization's board of directors would have the final say regarding the initiative. And so this is the case when such an organization fills the role of the community entity. The community advisory board is typically composed of community stakeholders and the private, public, and volunteer sectors, and is a requirement under Reaching Home to have the CAB in place. And the CAB plays a key role in encouraging partnerships, coordinating community efforts related to homelessness, and integrating the efforts with those of the province or territories, and recommending projects for approval to the community entity. So there's some pros and cons to this model. This is where the community agencies can be brought in and involved, and especially including people with lived experience. So the pros, the organization can be totally dedicated and committed to this process. The championing, of this coordinated access system is much more easily led, and it actually has the ability of being dedicated to this issue alone, to pull in, to connect with, to identify champions that are going to be helpful. They're able to be at arm's length from the organization. So in a sense, there's decreased liability and risk management. So they don't have as many rules and restrictions over them, and they have much more freedom in what they do. They can recruit as they need to fill specific roles. And they also might have the ability to increase and build upon capital that they might need to move things forward. And there's the ability to have greater Indigenous leadership and community coordination in this, because you have a lot more freedom to hire and bring in who it is you want to, and who's going to be best suited for those roles. An organization like this is able to connect much more effectively with the community in many ways, and address the things that they want for change, because they're not hindered so much by sometimes the political influence that's there. And they also have the ability to actually push the envelope a little bit more around policy and system change. Some of the cons of this model, though, is that it does sometimes create outside pressures on other organizations for them to take more action, and they might not have the capacity to do that. Sometimes it adds some concerns about adding another nonprofit organization to the mix of funding, which speaks to the third bullet. And so therefore funds sometimes feel like they're taken away from people who are providing direct services. And they may have a direction that's not necessarily supported by the overall organization on key issues. And they require more substantial resources to operate and maintain. So as I said, if you can imagine, if an organization like that has its own data department, they're going to have other similar separate departments, which requires a lot more staffing and so forth. So it is a more costly venture to operate that way. The next one is the community entity as a branch of an existing organization. Okay, so an example of this would be maybe somebody like the United Way is the community entity, or there's a part of the United Way that operates as the community entity. And so they will have a section of their organization that operates as the management and the staff of the community entity. And then they involve other community agencies and or the CAB and so forth as representatives and givers of guidance and so forth. And again, they should be including people with lived experience and those of Indigenous representation on those committees. So the pros of this, again, they can also do a lot of good work regarding championing of homelessness issues in the community. They are as well are able to have a bit of an arm's length approach to things. They're a lower cost option to maintain because typically they already have staffing that exists, and they may have to add a few roles here and there, but it's not nearly as big of a financial undertaking as the first one. They are often seen as already being very community-based, so they usually have a good reputation, and you know, it's easy for people to accept them in that role. They also are very often more closely connected to people with lived expertise and experience, and have the capacity to hire those folks. And there is an infrastructure that already exists that again allows for cost savings and more efficiency in getting things moving quickly. Some of the challenges with this model is concerns that maybe it's an organization that isn't Indigenous led. Contracting with one agency sometimes can be viewed in not so happy circumstances by the rest of the community. They feel like people are being favored. They may have less experience with policy change and systems work. Their system planning expertise may not exist with this service provider. And they are also ultimately beholden to this board of directors. And sometimes that board of directors has different ideas or mandates about what they think need to happen or what the focus is of that organization. The third model that I want to share and highlight is where the municipality is the community entity. And so again, you have, so part of my image got cut off here, I apologize for that. You have a city council usually that is, you know, sort of at the top, and then city management and all of the different departments. And then you have the manager of a department that usually takes on the role of the CE. And then again, you're involving your CAB and your community representatives. And municipal and regional governments are most commonly the organizations that are used for CEs for federal homelessness funding. In Ontario, provincial funding for homelessness is always delivered through a local government acting as what's called service managers. And as a result, many regional or municipal governments in Ontario hold the CE role as well, and will coordinate that funding. So some of the pros of this is, again, you can imagine with a municipality, there is tremendous amounts of administrative capacity. They have, you know, again, all of the accounting and payroll and HR things in place. And plus there's usually several other roles that are there administratively to help out with being able to make things happen. The city isn't a service provider, and so it's often seen as neutral, or it can play that neutral role where they're not competing for funding with the service providers and things like that. The cities or municipalities often have other initiatives going on within their work that can be connected or that can be tied together, and so therefore they can augment each other and provide greater support. And being a municipality or level of government allows them greater capacity politically and connection with other levels of government. And it actually forces the municipality to be involved in the efforts around homelessness, and which is a great thing. Sometimes municipalities aren't so heavily involved when they need to be. And then, as I mentioned, you know, the different access to structures and levels of government and other departments that are within the municipality give them greater capacity to pull off different projects. Some of the challenges, though, that come with being a community entity is often community entities are not Indigenous led, or often municipalities are not Indigenous led. And oftentimes municipalities are not necessarily trusted completely by Indigenous members of the community, partly because they're seen as a government body. Sometimes people feel like that the municipality as the community entity gives them too much control, and they don't want them to have any more control than they feel like they already do. The staff team, you know, within the city, if that municipality doesn't necessarily communicate and work together as much as they could, or they're not willing to allocate resources from different departments, then the staff that is involved in as the CE staff don't necessarily have that same system planning expertise. And so it's difficult for them to sometimes do some of the work that's tied into that. And bureaucracy within the city makes it challenging sometimes to address some initiatives that need to be moved forward. And so, for example, I know there have been situations I have experienced where, as part of a municipality, we were not able to actually engage in certain projects because the political viewpoint, the concerns, the worries about politics and the bureaucracy made city council and other people who were at higher levels of decision making than we were not allow those things to happen. So that can be a challenge, which again leads to sometimes an inability to take some of the risks that are needed to be taken in this work. And then the city mandates. Of course, every department within a municipality falls under the overarching mandates of the city. And so either with leadership or with other things that happen, changes occur to those mandates, which might make it challenging. In a sense, in a way that things might change if our federal government changes. And so then sometimes mandates change, which puts a lot of stress or potential stress on the work that we do. And then the city is also in the hot seat. And that's an uncomfortable place for them to be. And that causes sometimes restriction in the things that you can do, because the municipality is worried about being in the hot seat and what that means for them. So I'm going to stop sharing there. As you've had a chance to sort of absorb some of this information, think about how that applies to you. I'd love to know where some of you feel like you fall, and if these models fit for you, or if you've had ways that you have adapted these models. And yeah, and then just any other questions that are out there. So I don't know if we have other comments or questions that are worth noting, Quinn, but.
We don't have any active questions right now, but I would just really encourage people to jump into the Q&A or jump into the chat and throw some questions up there. If they have them, this is a great opportunity to get them answered. And if you do want to ask them verbally, just let us know in the chat and we can allow you to speak, and we'll be able to hear you. I feel like allow you to speak came off as a little more draconian than I meant it to.
These slides and this recording will be available by the end of the week for sure, if not within the next couple of days on our website, so people can get access to this information then. But I'd be curious to know if this information feels like it resonates in any way, or if you feel like it's challenging for you to kind of connect the dots with what you heard, what we were talking about there. I think, Quinn, it looked like you posted the Reaching Home guide. Did you post the link to that in there? Was that
something? Yeah, I've posted a lot of things. The answer to the amount of UN the UN numbers, which was 51 to 193. UN Charter, the Reaching Home Coordinated Access Guide is linked into the chat, as well as the website, Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network. And not the big red ball you were talking about, but a very cool one where they make plasma. I think it's at the University of Wisconsin. It's very cool.
That's great. That's great. I think, just if I was to make a final comment from myself, I don't know that I would get too hung up on a lot of really specific details regarding these models. I would get more caught up in what the mandate of your governance and coordinated access system is, and what the roles entail, and what you're trying to accomplish with it, and build from there the system that's going to work for you. Keeping in mind that, like I said, it is important. I've seen firsthand where a community, if they do not have someone who is sort of carrying that big red ball, the coordination of that system tends to wane, tends to suffer and struggle, and then you end up with disheartenment and contention and challenges and competition and things like that within the system, as opposed to having this united front. I see coordinated access as a whole bunch of teams coming together to form one great big super team, and turning all of the people experiencing homelessness into their community clients. I hate to use that word, but as opposed to each organization having their own clients, it becomes a city, or it becomes a community responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's great. I do have another question that has popped in. So this is from Nina. We are running under a strange model. The CE is an existing NGO, and they have subcontracted us as a new NGO in existence since last year to run coordinated access in the community. So the CE structure here in Whitehorse is like a combo between the first two options. It's challenging for me to see how we as a CA lead, HMIS lead, can have any impact on how we set things up.
So, yeah, I don't know totally how to respond to that, other than if you as the CA lead and an HMIS lead have not been involved, have not been asked for your input, and have not been, if you haven't been part of that development process, then I would say that the system has missed the boat on an important part of this. If your responsibility as the CA lead is to kind of keep the ball rolling, so to speak, then you have to be aware of things. You have to be able to make suggestions and recommendations and bring back to the table key information that is going to inform the ongoing monitoring and development and shifting of that system. That's the other thing, is a system like this and governance has to allow the system to be a living thing, an ever changing and shifting thing, like the sands in the desert. Like it has to move with, with the changes that are occurring. And so, and I mean, when it comes to the data aspect of things, data is what has to inform, your stories and your experiences that you have, and the data together has to work together to inform the changes that are being made and recommended. So if you are the lead in those two things, or whoever the lead is in those two things, if you're not directly involved in informing sort of policies and things like that within the system, then there's a disconnect.
I think that brings us to the end of the questions today. And what I am going to do is I'm going to drop both mine and Wally's emails into the chat so you can see them and access them. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to respond as quickly as we can. And that brings us to the end of our time together.
I will say, just before everybody leaves, that there is a follow-up webinar for this scheduled for next week, but because of some things that have transpired within our team, and part of that is that Quinn and I both have to be away out of town next week. Our other team member has some personal things they're dealing with, so we're going to be moving that webinar to a different. So just so everybody here is aware, and you will get notification if you're registered for it of the new dates. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming in. Thank you for all your great questions and comments. I really appreciate you being here.
Take care, folks.
Okay. Bye-bye, guys.